Well, tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome to another Elgin webinar. My name is Mike Manson, Chief Executive of Elgin, and it's a great pleasure today to bring this webinar on a very important topic, e-invoicing. The future of accounts payable is now. And joining us today is Chris and Perry. And just before I introduce them, if you're new to an Elgin webinar and you've not used our question area before, on your GoToWebinar menu button, you'll see a tab called Questions. Now, at the end of the presentation, we'd love to answer questions from you, so please pop them into the Questions tab and I'll relay them to our guest speakers. Well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris Elliott, the Solution Specialist for Desktop Imaging. Now, Chris is Desktop Imaging's resident e-invoicing lead based right here in New Zealand. Now, with a focus on driving digital transformation, Chris has successfully helped organizations adopt e-invoicing solutions that enhance efficiency, accuracy, and security. His expertise lies in navigating the complexities of balancing customer requirements against the Peppol specifications and in fostering collaboration amongst all stakeholders. He's passionate about advancing the future of e-invoicing, and Chris is dedicated to sharing his insights and best practices to help organizations adapt to this evolving landscape. So a big welcome to Chris. And also we have joining us Perry Leolios, and Business Development Lead for APAC, Tickstar. So Perry has a wealth of experience in the e-invoicing space, including former roles as New Zealand Government's lead advisor for e-invoicing and the Director for e-invoicing adoption for the Australian Government. So a big roles there. Currently, Perry is the Business Development Lead for e-invoicing at Xero and responsible for growing the Tickstar Peppol access point across the APAC region. So welcome, Chris and Perry, and thank you so much for giving up your time to present today. I'll pass over to Chris.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone. As Mike has pointed out, the topic of the day is e-invoicing. So to start with, we'll just give you a quick breakdown around how we're going to have our conversation today. As Mike said, I'm from Desktop Imaging, and through our partnership with Tickstar, we provide e-invoicing enablement services and workflows as part of our DI invoicing service offering. Perry's from Tickstar to balance out the panel today, and I've tried to make him as nervous as humanly possible by threatening to ask him the curliest questions I can think of. So if you can think of a trickier question than me, you'll have my eternal gratitude. But in all seriousness, Perry does have a wealth of experience from his time with both the Australian Tax Office and MB here in New Zealand in the e-invoicing enablement space. And we've both got experience with Peppol e-invoicing, not just across Australia and New Zealand, but with customers and government agencies alike across the greater Asia Pacific region as well. So to start with, I'm going to talk a little bit about this thing called Peppol and how it fits into the conversation about e-invoicing. We're going to talk about what e-invoices are and how they're different from email PDFs, just so that we're all on the same page. After that, I'll hand over to Perry. He'll talk a little bit about who's doing this already, adoption trends, statistics, and then of course the recently announced changes to the government procurement rules and what that might mean for councils in New Zealand. Amid his talk, I will try and ask him curly questions, but he might preempt me and answer them in advance, so let's see how uncomfortable we can make him. Finally, we'll then circle back just to recap some of the advantages of e-invoicing before we finish up with some suggestions of what you could do to start planning for change based on the assumption that an e-invoicing project is, if not imminent, likely to be somewhat inevitable in the foreseeable future. So if you have any questions, as Mike said, fire them through in the questions function. We'll do our absolute best to answer as many as we can. But both Perry and I will be at the conference next week as well on Stand 27. So if you don't want to ask your questions today, or if they occur to you after the fact, then bring them along to the conference. If you aren't going to the conference, you're of course more than welcome to reach out to us directly, and I'll leave our contact info on the last screen at the very, very end. So with that preamble, let's crack into it. So where we begin is when we're talking about e-invoicing in New Zealand, you can't really talk about it without using this word Peppol. But depending on the context, when someone says Peppol, it can mean slightly different things. So I wanted to start off today by just clarifying the different aspects of Peppol and hopefully help clear up any confusion about what it actually is and maybe even what it isn't. So at its heart, Peppol is an e-procurement framework, and it's designed kind of with three moving parts. As you can kind of see on the screen there are the document formats, the network itself, and then there is a governance element to it as well. The goal of Peppol was to enable the fast, secure, accurate exchange of procurement documents while also being an open standard that anyone can adopt. And the idea was that it wouldn't matter what finance system you and your trading partners were using, you could all still exchange e-procurement documents with them. So if we fast forward to what that means in practice today, it means that even if you guys are using, Tech1 or Ozone or any one of a number of other ERP options, your suppliers can be using anything from Xero through to SAP, and they could all still be exchanging e-invoices with you. And that interoperability is through the formats and the network, not through the systems themselves. While there are some other global standards for e-invoicing, Peppol is the one that has been adopted and endorsed by both the Australian and New Zealand governments as the chosen national standard in both countries. And a big part of why comes down to the fact that that Peppol is not only the formats and specifications for what an e-invoice is, but it also provides the regulated network through which the wider suite of those e-procurement documents can be exchanged. So some people trying to get their head around Peppol might compare it to the EDI frameworks of yesteryears, where typically you'd have a large organization trying to push data exchange standards onto their smaller trading partners. Oftentimes they'll provide little choice in integrators or partners and perhaps not really care much that from perspective of those smaller trading partners, they likely had multiple formats to adopt and manage depending on how many different supply chains they were in. Peppol, on the other hand, was designed very deliberately to avoid that situation and level the playing field. The structure of the network meant that trading partners can use different providers to achieve their e-invoicing goals. But more than that, the adoption of Peppol in Australia and New Zealand means that many of the interoperability differences between those closed supply chains are removed in order to create not just an industry or a national standard, but a trans-Tasman standard for e-invoicing. So before I go too far off on a tangent, coming back to my slide, there are three general meanings to Peppol, which are document formats, the network, and the organizations involved in the governance. And of course, all three of these elements overlap. So starting with the document types, let's talk a little bit about what an e-invoice actually is and how it's different from an emailed PDF. You'll recall I just said that Peppol is an e-procurement framework, and that's because the e-invoice is just one of several different e-procurement document types within that framework. I'm not going to go off on that tangent here today, but I did just want to make it clear that Peppol isn't just about e-invoicing alone, even though that's what we're focusing on at the moment. So what is an e-invoice? People assume often that a PDF that has been emailed is an e-invoice simply by virtue of the fact that it's electronic rather than physical. However, that's not the case. A PDF, despite being electronic, is still created and designed around the assumption that it needs to be read by a person and that one day it might need to be transformed into an A4 piece of paper. And that piece of paper is still a fundamental assumption that impacts how we handle those PDFs, even if no one actually ever prints it. Peppol e-invoicing, on the other hand, is about transforming the nature of the invoice itself and changing the vehicle used to communicate the transaction information. It's about improving the way that the information is communicated, knowing that it's going to end up in an electronic finance system rather than a physical filing cabinet. So the e-invoice isn't a document in a kind of piece of paper sense of the word document, because it's a collection of data designed to be read by an application rather than a person. Now, it's this difference in format that allows the applications to ingest e-invoices faster, more accurately, and more consistently, and it also enables some automation options a heck of a lot more easily. So boiling it all the way down to, I guess, the basics, a Peppol e-invoice contains a whole bunch of mandatory fields for what it must contain in order to be communicated through the network. So for example, there are the common elements you'd expect to see on an invoice, like a date and an invoice number and a total, etc. However, there's also a bunch of non-mandatory fields that they can have, but aren't made compulsory at a transmission level. To help bridge that gap between mandatory and non-mandatory, the New Zealand and Australian governments worked together and came up with what's called the AUNZ industry practice statements. And that governs what non-mandatory fields are considered best practice to include. And so this is where things like purchase order numbers and payment due dates and the New Zealand GST number fall into. They're optional at a specification level, even if they're mandatory for your business process. Now, as a receiver of e-invoices for accounts payable purposes, this is awesome because it creates a level of consistency to what you're expecting to receive. However, it's important that we're all clear about what it actually means in practice, because while those optional fields are strongly recommended and their use is considered best practice, nevertheless, they aren't mandatory, and a Peppol e-invoice may still be considered valid for a transmission, even if the fields aren't being used. So for example, if your accounts payable rules require that all invoices have a PO number, you could still receive an e-invoice that doesn't have one. Your validation process would then have to handle that e-invoice as an exception, as your requirement can't be pushed back onto the network at a format or a network level to force a non-mandatory field to become mandatory. You'd still have to have an exceptions management process around your accounts payable invoices to manage that validation against your business rules. I mean, to kind of put it another way, if you were receiving an invoice in the mail, you wouldn't expect the mailman to open the invoice and not deliver something that didn't have a purchase order. So in the same way, you can't kind of push that requirement onto the network itself, but rather accept it and then deal with it as an AP exception. That's a little bit of a segue through to the network itself. And unlike some of the other e-invoice or EDI frameworks, Peppol includes the secure network through which all the parties are verified and all the document formats are being enforced. So the example that I've got on the screen is not a diagram of the network itself, but more a workflow representation for how the network operates in an accounts payable scenario when you are the receiver. And you'll see in the diagram that the different senders can use different access points that allow them to send via the Peppol network. And the main role of an access point provider is to verify the identity of the parties on the network and to enforce the document format rules. And it's a big part of what makes Peppol so appealing, because the interoperability is achieved between trading partners while still preserving that choice of technology provider. Becoming an access point, which is where Tickstar fit into this equation, becoming an access point for the network is a process that requires accreditation and certification from both the Peppol authority within the country you're trading from, and also from Open Peppol themselves. And this ensures that there's an integrity to the network, because not only are all the technical elements enforced and all the security elements, but there are also elements like know your customer or KYC and identity checks that are enforced, so that you can have confidence that when you receive an e-invoice, it has in fact come from the party claiming to have sent it. Tickstar are a global access point provider to the network and can help with getting the e-invoices into and out of the network, whereas Desktop Imaging can help by providing the service that integrates between the access point and your finance systems. And what that means in practice is that your counsel could be received to register to receive e-invoices with Tickstar. Desktop Imaging could then receive those e-invoices on your behalf. We then validate them against your business rules and your vendor tables alongside any emailed invoices that are also being received through other channels, and ensure a consistent accounts payable process. We can manage any exceptions and rejections and notifications, and then provide that last mile of delivery into your finance system. But coming back to this idea of interoperability, the easiest way to get your head around how it applies to the Peppol network is to use a bit of an analogy of cell phones. When you buy a cell phone, you also need to have a relationship with a telco to connect you to its cellular network before you can actually start making calls or sending texts. The various telcos sort out the technical formats so that when I have an Apple iPhone with, say, One New Zealand and Perry has a Samsung Galaxy with Spark, we can still call and text each other seamlessly, even though we're using different brands of mobile phone and different cellular providers. And that, in essence, is what interoperability is all about. It's giving you the freedom of choice of brand and partner without impacting the functionality of what's being delivered. Now, that's true of the Peppol e-invoicing network as well. You can have complete choice over which access point provider you want to use and which finance systems you want to use, but you can still transact with all of your trading partners on the network because the access points and the network handle the data transformation for you. In order to transact on the network, whether as a sender or a receiver or both, you need a globally unique identifier. Here in New Zealand, that is the NZBN, or the New Zealand business number. Because that number is globally unique and because the identities of all the parties are being verified by the access point providers, what this means is you can only be registered to receive e-invoices through one access point provider. You can send through as many as you need to, depending on how many systems you have that generate invoices, but you can only receive through one access point. So think of it a little bit like posted mail. You can address an envelope and then drop it into any post box in a city, and it will eventually get to where it's going, but you can only have one letterbox at the end of your driveway to actually receive stuff. I am conscious of time, and so I want to move on and just quickly touch on governance and how that fits into the Peppol puzzle as part number 3. Peppol e-invoicing is regulated to a degree by the accreditation process for the access point providers, and it's governed by the Open Peppol agreements. So this creates a hierarchy of sorts, where at the top you have Open Peppol, who are a not-for-profit based in Brussels, because Peppol came out of Europe originally. And that governs the document standards. They also run what's called the SML, which is essentially a directory service identifying which access point provider each entity on the network is using. They appoint the local Peppol authorities within each country and region. Here in New Zealand, our Peppol authority is the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, or MB. Underneath them are those regional authorities, which, as I just said, in New Zealand is MB. They are the New Zealand regulator, in a sense. They, in partnership with the Australian Tax Office, administer the AUNZ format extension, making the e-invoice content specific to our local requirements and less reliant on the European-centric stuff. They promote the adoption of e-invoicing to government and the wider economy, including adherence to the industry practice statements for best practice. They help regulate accreditation of access point providers that are allowed to connect New Zealand entities to the Peppol network, and they do that in partnership with the ATO in Australia. So if you're an access point on one side of the Tasman, then you can also be one on the other side as well. Lastly, there are those access point providers at the bottom there too. They are essentially the gatekeepers of the network. So anyone transacting, whether as a sender or as a receiver, can only do so through an accredited access point. The access points have those strict know your customer or KYC obligations, so they validate the identities and the identifiers of all the parties that they're connecting to the network. And that's a big part of why you can have confidence that receiving an invoice has in fact come from who's claiming to have sent it, and third-party impersonation fraud all but disappears. Access points very generally come in two flavors. You have what I'd like to call the proprietary access points, where they connect their own platforms and only their own platforms. So for example, you might have a solution like ESCA for accounts payable, and they are an access point provider in New Zealand. And if you're using them as your accounts payable platform, then it would make a heck of a lot of sense to use them as your access point provider as well, since it's already integrated into their platform. But if you don't use their platform, then their access point is actually of no practical use to you. The other type is what I'd call the non-proprietary access point providers, who will integrate with any system to enable e-invoicing for a particular platform. And this is where platforms like Tickstar fit in, where it doesn't really matter what your finance system is. Tickstar can provide yourself or your technology partners like Desktop Imaging a way to connect your system to the network regardless. So hopefully that's given a bit of a high-level overview of what Peppol is and what e-invoices are. So I'm going to take a wee break, have a drink, hand over to Perry, and he's going to talk a little bit about who's doing this, usage stats, adoption, etc., etc.
Yeah, before jumping into that, Chris, I might just add back into the governance element. It's not just accreditation, it's also re-accreditation. So every single year we're going through an accreditation process, again with MB, and this also involves, probably most importantly for the integrity of the network, a security assessment by the Australian Taxation Office on behalf of Australia and New Zealand. So it's probably a benefit of Peppol that all providers are annually kind of maintained for the network.
So accreditation is not a one and done thing. You have to keep earning it, and as security and cyber elements evolve over time, the access points have to stay abreast of it all to stay current and accredited.
Yeah, and also require security certifications such as ISO 27001.
Good point.
Excellent. Well, to touch base and briefly introduce myself again, so as mentioned, my name is Perry and I work for Tickstar. And in a nutshell, Tickstar is a wholly owned subsidiary of Xero Limited and the glue that connects Xero to the Peppol network. Now, as Chris mentioned, I'm here to talk about the adoption rates and a little bit later, some of the government policy. So first off, thanks to Envy for the adoption report you can see on your screen. This dashboard's actually updated monthly, and this can be found on the MB website for eInvoicing, which is eInvoicing.govt.nz. Feel free to jump on there, have a look around and look at some of the resources and statistics. Now, firstly, looking at the report just as a whole, we can see that eInvoicing is on the rise in New Zealand. Focusing on the left section is where the business registrations so far. So to date, we've got 24,000 Kiwi businesses registered on the network. And as you can see, this has doubled in the past year. We are also aware that Xero is currently progressing a big push to register more of its customer base, and we're expecting the total number of registrations to double once again by the end of the month. Looking to the right side now, usage has also experienced significant increases of late. As of the end of September, there's been a 24% increase in monthly transactions from the previous month, and there's been a 25% increase in unique senders from the previous month. So what does that mean? This means that not only are we scaling up volume with a small subset of businesses, this means that more and more businesses are participating in e-invoicing. We've had a look at an early look at some of the October data, and it's indicating similar growth patterns in transactional volumes and unique senders as we witnessed in this report here. So very positive next few months we feel we're in line for. But who are the businesses that are actually involved so far in e-invoicing? So first off, we're seeing some really great early support from New Zealand's large enterprise sector. Pardon me. So MB have established a working group with about 20 of the largest and most prominent organisations in New Zealand. We're experiencing something really unique here, where we've got market leaders, often of the same industry, working together to advocate for e-invoicing and the benefit for the overall economy. Already, we've seen some of the front runners adopt e-invoicing. This includes names such as Spark, Datacom, Bunnings, Countdown, Office Max, Fonterra, and ACC. All of those organisations have already started sending and/or receiving e-invoices, and are looking at starting to scaling up their volume with trading partners as we speak. Now, one of the potential barriers I hear from these organisations is that they do not want to burden their small business trading partners with costly or complex e-invoicing implementations. So what I'd like to confirm that Xero has implemented this functionality for free for all of its customers, and this is similar to many of the other small business accounting software providers in New Zealand. So essentially, most businesses in New Zealand already have this capability available to them, and more often than not, it's freely available in their current software subscriptions. So e-invoicing is not simply an initiative specific to the New Zealand government. This is rapidly being adopted all over the world, as Chris touched on a little earlier. And we're actually seeing the Australian government working in tandem with MBIE, and they have already over 140,000 businesses and government entities registered onto the network. Now, while New Zealand has far smaller rates of registrations and transactional volume, what we're actually seeing is a much better growth rate in New Zealand compared to Australia. And what we'd really like to do is keep that momentum going. And naturally, as you can imagine, there's a little bit of competition between the two governments on who can get this initiative moving faster. So we're also seeing this is being gradually mandated in Asia, particularly with Singapore and Malaysia. Both are progressing B2B and B2G mandates for e-invoicing. And Europe's also had mandates in place for public procurement. And really, this has been active for a couple of years when all suppliers to government must send a valid e-invoice to any government entity at all levels of government in most countries or all countries in the European Commission. Did I get that one right, Chris? I think so.
I think so. I think you got that right.
Perfect.
Hey, just a quick question while you found a pause there. At the start, you mentioned registered receivers. Just want to clarify, did you mean registered entities? Did you mean receivers or senders and receivers?
So registered entities, what we use for the measuring in the reports here is businesses, an organisation that is registered to receive a Peppol document on the e-invoicing network. So right now, as you've clarified, we're really just focusing on the invoice. So I think it's probably safe to say that 24,000 Kiwi businesses have indicated they can receive a Peppol e-invoice. And the number on senders, what MBIE's recording at the moment is just whoever's actively sending for that month. So we're seeing a lot more of a fluctuation on that number. But both are probably important.
It is possible then that we have senders who are configured and ready to be able to send, but if they aren't actually being asked to by their trading partners, we're not seeing them pop up on the reports yet. So when we're talking about registered entities, we can only really see who's ready to receive, not who's ready to send. And there are a whole bunch of, I guess, ghost senders, depending on who their trading partners are.
Yeah, and dare I say the name of our competitor, but we're all working together on e-invoicing. Xero and MyOb already have the send capability in the software. Businesses can send without needing to register to receive. So we're starting to look very close to your 90% plus, noting New Zealand's 97% small businesses. We're starting to look up at the 90% of businesses probably can already send an e-invoice. They just haven't had the demand from their trading partners as of yet. So I went global. I might just hone back into New Zealand and let's start having a look at the New Zealand government and what progress has been made in this space to date. So firstly, as the drivers of the initiative, MBIE were one of the first government agencies to adopt, and they're already processing, I think, a little bit over 10% of invoices right now as e-invoices. In total, there's nearly 50 government agencies that are already enabled to receive e-invoices, and 26 of these are from central government, and local government is represented as well. So far, my last check, there was 4 councils, and there's a few others that are in the process of implementing. So the sector is starting to move in line with the broader government. What we're also starting to see is some movement in the space for government suppliers. So the best performing agency so far, I've been advised, has transitioned to receive 20% of their supplier invoices are already coming in as e-invoices. So that's kind of setting the benchmark but other agencies are starting to hone in on that quickly as their activities improve. And so many government agencies have already started writing out to their supplier bases and indicating that e-invoicing is their preferred method of receiving e-invoices. I think some of the more prominent ones, which we're really happy about, is I know IRD has done it 2 or 3 times already, started writing out to their suppliers requesting e-invoices. Now, I've even heard some anecdotes that the MBIE invoicing project team, they've gone offline for a couple of days and they just sit there like a call center and mass call lots and lots of small businesses. and start educating about e-invoicing and encouraging them to start sending e-invoices to government. Now, why this is important is because, as Chris has shared with e-invoicing, it's an open network, and all the standards mean any system is sending to any system. So any work that these agencies are doing to get their own suppliers onboarded, this can actually be leveraged by everyone else. So when you become enabled for e-invoicing, you'll find you'll already have trading partners that treat this as the norm. Before I jump onto the next slide, Chris, did you have any commentary or questions on the uptake so far? You've always got something to say.
I've always got something to say, and I'm trying to think of something curlier I could ask you to make you flustered, but alas, I'm coming up wanting at the moment.
I'll fluster myself just fine, thanks. All right, jump over to the next slide, thanks, mate. All right, so why is all of this relevant for local councils? Well, to kick things off, I'll probably share some of the recent announcements we've had from the Beehive. So on the 5th of November 2024, Economic Development Minister, the Honourable Melissa Lee, and Small Business and Manufacturing Minister, the Honourable Andrew Bailey, announced a rewrite of Rule 51 of the Government Procurement Rules. This was to begin the transition for wider government agencies to become e-invoicing capable. Now, what do these rules actually state? So the rules require mandated government agencies to abide by the following by 1st of January 2026. The first is to implement send capability for agencies that send over 2,000 domestic invoices annually. The second, an inverse of that one, to implement e-invoicing receive capability for agencies that receive over 2,000 domestic invoices annually. The third is to pay at least 95% of all the domestic trade e-invoices within 5 days. And the fourth is to report all your invoice payment times, so that's for e-invoicing and non-e-invoicing, to MBIE, and they'll collate the information and they're actually going to start publishing it online. So it's starting to see a lot of, I think, leadership and transparency in government around adopting these digital solutions and supporting faster payments and cash flow through the economy. Now, this is actually not the first time that government policy was put in place to support e-invoicing. As recently as I think it was about 2 years ago, IRD's released a series of changes where the definition of a tax invoice was updated to taxable supply information. And then there was also a requirement or a perception on a requirement that an invoice needed to explicitly state tax invoice. This has also been removed. So I guess by virtue, an e-invoice is classified, the document type, it is a tax invoice, and therefore is considered redundant to state that once again on an invoice. What these rules actually indicate, they indicate a shift from focusing on the document management side of things to more transactional data running back and forth between businesses. So what do all these changes actually mean for the local councils? Well, I guess first off, the government procurement rules are mandated and apply to approximately 135 agencies. And then furthermore, there's another 150 plus crown entities that are expected to apply the rules. I can't say expected today. Now, local councils, they're highly encouraged to apply the procurement rules. And those councils that wish to be classified as being compliant with the procurement rules are going to need to align with these upcoming e-invoicing requirements. It's also probably worth mentioning that Commonwealth companies are also encouraged to adopt these new rules, and MBIE's focusing on a big push with those as well, because many are considered large organisations in New Zealand as well. Now, as quoted by MBIE, businesses who trade with government will begin to treat this as the norm and expect all government to assist them with cash flow and support digital solutions. Now, these rules are going to come into effect on the 1st of January 2026. And this means that agencies who want to be compliant to send and receive e-invoices will need to get things moving before that date. So you should probably consider a project that's running over quarter three next calendar year at the absolute latest. But knowing how long these things take, that actually means you'll need to start looking now or in the early new year to assess your requirements, scope, set up your business case, and acquire budget for the next financial year. Now, thankfully, MBIE's established a whole of government panel, which can be accessed by any type of government entity. And this will allow you to procure services, well, procure e-invoicing services without the need to undergo extensive procurement processes. So MBIE's already done all the due diligence, shortlisted. So I think Chris mentioned the access points. In total in New Zealand, there's about 42 access points. MBIE has shortlisted that in their panel to 7 providers, and that's access points and or their implementation partners. So what I'm really happy to share is Tickstar and Desktop Imaging, our partnership has been selected as one of those 7 providers to make the panel. So there is some streamlined ways to acquire Peppol services to get your project moving. Now, where do we actually see all this moving forward? Well, first off, I believe this is just the beginning of policy measures to drive uptake of e-invoicing in New Zealand. So on top of this, we're already seeing central government agencies, they're being given quotas to rise their e-invoicing uptake to that 90% level, and that should have a flow-on effect to wider government and local councils. And following the ministerial announcement, MBIE was also tasked to initiate consultation for another set of changes to the procurement rules. Now, these changes include setting requirements on certain government suppliers that they must send e-invoices to government. Now, when we've read certain or specific government suppliers, our interpretation is that MBIE is looking at mandating this for suppliers that are over a certain size or over a certain amount of transactional volume. So these policies are designed to help small businesses and reduce administrative burden and increase the cash flow. So what we'd actually like to see in the future is a state where the New Zealand government is setting the gold standard by offering fully digitised procurement experiences to their customers and all of their suppliers. Chris, anything that I might have glossed over or missed on the talk on the policy side of things?
Not on the policy side of things. I think it might just be worth reiterating that there are a heck of a lot of benefit to small businesses as well. And while we often tend to focus in our conversations with councils about the benefits to the council, those councils don't exist in a silo, and they support a lot of small businesses within their local communities. And a very, very large percentage, like starting with a 9, of those small businesses in those local communities will use kind of one of 3 main finance systems, a Xero, an MYOB, or a QuickBooks. And all 3 of those platforms have e-invoicing capability ready to go now. So by becoming enabled and allowing those small businesses to send e-invoices to a council, you're enabling their automation and efficiencies and improving their cash flows as well. So there is an element of, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, digital reciprocity or digital altruism, that not all of the benefits of e-invoicing are for the council specifically, but also for the wider communities that those councils serve.
Yep, I think similarly, I heard a really good anecdote from Westpac Bank, who were one of the early adopters for e-invoicing. And I do understand banks probably don't have the same cash flow issues as all other organisations in New Zealand, but they found that they were trying to speed up their processes to pay their small business suppliers as fast as possible. And they've got OCR scanning of invoices in place. And now they've gone e-invoicing. They're having many situations where businesses are getting paid in the same day. As long as the invoice is meeting all those requirements, e-invoices are coming in, getting checked off as they match the purchase order, and payment executed straight away. So we're really starting to see the small businesses that are using e-invoicing to send to government and large enterprise realising those benefits as well.
And I mean, that's probably a good segue to hand back to me to talk about benefits, unless there was something else you wanted to add there, Terry?
No, over to you and over to the benefits.
That's cool. Yeah, and I think just touching on what you just said at the end there, that the benefits, these aren't just hypothetical, they are starting to be realized and they are starting to be measured. So they are real and practical benefits that, you know, can be observed by individual entities that are starting an e-invoicing journey. I've tried to cram them all onto one slide. So I guess at the start, we can see kind of consistency, and I touched on that earlier. The Peppol formats mean that what you're receiving is going to be predictable and consistent, and it's going to be less likely to fail your data validations around your accounts payable process. It's going to make integration a heck of a lot easier because you're not going to be relying on traditional data extraction methods like OCR capture software. And that kind of segues into accuracy, because there's a reduced dependency on OCR, which is never 100% accurate. Eliminating some of that character recognition to extract text from a PDF, along with minimizing or even eliminating some of the manual human data entry errors, it means that the data accuracy going into your systems is a heck of a lot more accurate. Hand in hand with the accuracy is, of course, the speed, because there's no need to have those capture applications or the manual data entry. It means that documents are going to be processed a lot faster. What you're receiving is quite literally the data that was entered into the sender's system when they generated the invoice in the first place. So there's no reinterpretation of that data. The accuracy goes up, the speed gets faster. Because they're arriving in your finance system faster and more accurately, this in turn enables a greater level of visibility, because invoices aren't being held in limbo as unread emails sitting in an inbox. Almost as soon as they arrive, they're being ingested and made visible, so you can start applying your accounts payable process to those invoices without the delay of a data capture or batching processes. And this increased visibility also means you're less likely to inadvertently lose or misplace an invoice, which in turn then minimizes the amount of supplier follow-up, people calling the AP team saying, hey, why hasn't my invoice been paid? This kind of brings us to automation. Having the invoice data existing as data in the first place enables us to start doing things like validation lookups and making some decisions around the content of the invoice against your business rules. So for example, it becomes easier to compare the invoice sender against your vendor tables to see if there's a vendor that's been onboarded for you. It becomes easier for us to do things like purchase order matching and looking up to see if a PO on an invoice is both valid and open within your system. We can even compare things like the payment account number on the invoice to the payment account information you have stored for that vendor in your finance system to make sure, you know, that everything is above board and payments are going to the right place. Security is kind of a factor I touched on earlier when I was talking about both access points and the network itself. Because the identifiers of all the parties on the network are globally unique, and because they can only be registered through one access point, and because those access points have those very, very strict rules around their accreditation process, this all adds up to a confidence that doesn't exist with email PDFs. When you receive an e-invoice from the network, you can be confident it's coming from the party who's claiming to have sent it. And that third-party impersonation fraud all but disappears overnight. Because there are no emails involved, there's no chance of emails being intercepted in transit or of PDFs being edited along the way before they're received. The last benefit I want to touch on is compliance. As Perry mentioned, if you're following the government procurement rules, then there are those new mandates in place around e-invoicing capability for both sending and receiving e-invoices. So an adoption project is possibly something that you may need to consider in order to stay compliant with those guidelines. However, even if that doesn't apply to your council specifically, there may still be trading partners you're transacting with that are starting to push their own compliance issues into their supply chain, which could have downstream effects on the councils that they're dealing with. If we consider that e-invoicing in New Zealand was only formally launched back in 2019, which was only 5 years ago, and we look at the evolution of the rules and the mandates to get to where we are now, it's becoming clearer and clearer that widespread adoption of e-invoicing is now inevitable. There is a day coming, maybe not this year or maybe not next year, but a day is coming where e-invoicing will become the norm and emailing PDFs will become, I guess, the more antiquated exception that people need to manage. So to wrap up, I kind of wanted to touch on what you guys can do as councils to get started and to start thinking about what an e-invoicing project in the future may look like. And there are a few key things you can do now ahead of a project to start laying that groundwork so that any projects you do downstream become just that little bit easier to manage. The first and most obvious thing is to review your AP process. One thing that we advocate quite strongly is that the way in which you process e-invoices should not be dependent on the method through which you receive them. So in other words, you shouldn't have a separate approval process for e-invoices compared to email PDFs. They should all go through the same decision-making process. They should all be subject to the same checks and balances. They should all be subject to the same sign-offs and approvals. So step one is to have a look at that AP process and make sure it's a good fit for the changes that might be coming. The next thing is to start thinking about NZBNs. And here in New Zealand, rather annoyingly, our tax identifier is different from our company identifier. So we've always used GST numbers on our invoices for tax purposes, but we've never really given much thought to the NZBN as a company identifier. However, you'd need to start thinking not just about how you can store NZBNs of your trading partners to make them easier, but also need to start thinking about how you can share your own with trading partners in places like your email signatures or your vendor comms or on purchase orders, etc. Start preparing the supply chain for changes so that they have the time and opportunity to start making those same changes for themselves as well. Organizational part numbers kind of dovetail into this idea of NZBNs because sometimes councils will have more than one trading name, and so they may receive invoices addressed to more than one entity. However, from a company registration perspective, those trading divisions or business units might all still be using the same NZBN, and this makes it a little more challenging when invoices for more than one trading entity are arriving through one channel. Fortunately, the clever folks at MB have thought about this problem and they've come up with the concept of an organizational part number, which functions essentially like a secondary NZBN. So if, for example, you're, say, a large city council and you also do the AP processes for, say, the zoo or the swimming pool or the information centres, then they could have an organisational part number separate and distinct from the council's primary NZBN, so that when vendors are transacting with any of them, they can address it to the correct one, which then enables automation filtering so it can be routed and processed accordingly based on who it was actually sent to. Supplier onboarding and supplier comms, making your supply chain aware of what might be coming is also really, really important. When you onboard new suppliers, consider what that onboarding form looks like and how you manage the expectations, what information you're asking from them. Are you asking on your supplier onboarding form for their NZBN? Are you communicating with them a preference to receive e-invoices over email PDFs? These considerations also flow through to areas like terms and conditions of your supplier agreements or procurement terms in tenders and RFPs. Indicating a preference for e-invoices then allows your trading partners to start making decisions based on knowing the impact of those decisions. I mean, after all, as we've heard from Perry, when adhering to the government procurement rules, e-invoices ought to be paid within 5 days, whereas email PDFs can take up to 10. So a vendor then has the ability to choose whether they want to make small changes on their side to get faster payments as a result. Lastly, of course, Perry and I will both be on the desktop imaging stand at the conference next week. We've worked together to come up with a demonstratable version of sending and receiving e-invoices. So if you want to know more, come by and see us. If you can't make it to the conference, feel free to reach out. We'd be more than happy to have a one-on-one call with you so you don't miss out on anything. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask them now using the question functions, and I think Mike is on standby to ask them on everybody's behalf. Though, of course, you can see our contact info is on the screen as well, so if you don't want to ask in a public format, you can email us or give us a call as well. Mike, well, I think that's us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Perry. That was a really good presentation that covered a lot, because my question towards the end was, okay, could you describe what a project would look like? But you've covered quite a lot of those steps in the end. Particularly the benefits sort of speak for themselves: the accuracy, the speed, the security, the consistency, the automation, visibility, and compliance. I think it's a matter of if not when. Is it sort of like, well, sort of, you're going to have to do this. So Elgum's happy to help work with councils, to work with you to try and make it as smooth and as easy as possible. And yeah, so we haven't got any questions yet. We've got a comment from Landcorp Farming. So they are saying that they're keen to receive the Peppol invoices from any local council they deal with. So there's a sort of starting, the drivers are coming through that councils can. So what I picked up was really useful is the NZBN number, putting that on our signatures and correspondence, however we do that. So that's a really good tip. Yeah, but let's see if we can ramp up from 24,000 to quite a few more. It just seems to make sense.
I guess not to preempt with a canned question or something, but one of the ones I often get when having this conversation is around something to the effect of, we have to keep our invoices for 7 years for IRD and tax compliance and the rest of it. Does this still meet that compliance level for document retention, aside from the finance and the tax implications? And the short answer is yes. There is information about that on IRD's website and MB's website. IRD themselves have shepherded change in legislation to kind of change the requirement of calling something a tax invoice to moving it to becoming taxable supply information. But perhaps the clearest indication that it's actually okay from that perspective is IRD are doing it themselves.
Yeah, IRD are one of the more entities, and it's nice because often we see government entities all with different agendas or projects and initiatives, but we're seeing some great alignment across government with pushing this forward.
Oh, we've got a question. What kind of costs are involved initially and ongoing? Can you start small, or is it a big bang approach?
I mean, without actually throwing dollar numbers out there, because there are different size scales and volumes for everything. Yes, in principle, you can start small and scale accordingly. I guess from a desktop imaging perspective, one of the first things that we need to understand is whether or not we're doing e-invoicing enablement as a project in isolation, or whether we're doing it as a component of a wider accounts payable process. If it's part of a wider accounts payable process where we're also looking at doing, validations and checks for email PDFs in parallel to e-invoices, then it becomes a little bit more challenging to differentiate where the cost sits, whether it's e-invoicing cost or email PDF cost. But very, very loosely, what we typically have is we have a little bit of upfront project setup, and then we'd have an ongoing volume-based click rate, if you like. So as you transition your vendors from emailing you PDFs to e-invoices, you don't see an increase in cost because you're just moving volume from one channel to another and achieving better benefits along the way for doing so.
And that panel I mentioned earlier should have some additional layers of transparency around the costing stuff. And if you're a council and you don't think you fit those models of the panel, still come talk to us, come talk to the providers, have the conversation and share what your invoicing looks like. And we can always provide much more accurate assessments when we know what we're dealing with on the system and the volume side.
That's actually a good point that I've overlooked in the moment, is that as part of our membership on that panel, we did have to provide, base rate cards. So if pricing is kind of the last step in your evaluation process of, okay, we're on board, we're going ahead, we want to do this, how much is it going to cost? Sign up for the panel, get all of those documents from the vendors and line us up against the other panelists to see which is going to be the best solution for you. And I mean, while we would absolutely love to work with you as a Tickstar and Desktop Imaging partnership, we aren't your only choice, and we would sooner see a rising tide lifts all boats. So we'd sooner see you become enabled with whichever provider you choose. Hopefully it's us, but it doesn't have to be.
Now, if you've got questions, please, your last chance to ask them while we've got Chris and Perry together. But as they said, they will be at the Elgin conference. If you aren't coming to the Elgin conference, you're going to miss out on one of the biggest conferences in our history of Elgin we've ever run. There are 10 countries coming, but there is over 80% of New Zealand councils, which is very important, present. But there's so much to learn from each other. So it's called Driving Collaboration. Now, we do have a question. Sorry, just click on this. What are the common challenges to supporting adoption of e-invoicing? For example, business might be uncertain about adopting a service that isn't been widely used yet.
Yeah, I think it's not as much uncertainty about that it's not been used yet. What we're experiencing is people actually don't know enough about e-invoicing yet. So a lot of these small trading partners have the capabilities, but they just haven't heard the demand from their customers. So it's really, I think we're just in those early stages where government's still doing plenty of promotion work, but really businesses want to get paid. So you're going to be more reactive to hearing from your trading partners.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest challenges I see is a misunderstanding, I guess, of what an e-invoice actually is. And I recall, I don't know the exact figure off the top of my head, but I recall Xero did a study, I think it was last year or the year before, where they asked their customer base about e-invoicing. And a concerningly high percentage of them already thought they were doing it simply by virtue of emailing a PDF. So it's breaking down those misconceptions, both within councils and within their supply chains, to say, well, no, you're not actually e-invoicing already. This is something different. It's something more secure, it's faster, and it's more accurate. We need to be having a slightly different conversation than the one that you think we're having.
Building on that, a lot of the challenges aren't actually around the project or the implementation. It's the educational components internally and with your trading partners.
Yeah, I'd 100% agree with that. I think probably the biggest challenge is the education and making sure everybody's on the same page. But certainly part of any enablement project that we work with touches on things like supplier comms, both before a go live, during, and afterwards, because e-invoicing is not a one and done. It's about changing things like your supplier onboarding. So when you get a new vendor 2 years from now, you're telling them, just by virtue of that onboarding process, this is how we want you to transact with us. So it isn't just about flipping a switch and turning a capability on. It's about then managing that capability so it is being used and everybody is seeing the benefits that it's promising.
And this comes back to the project costs against the anticipated value. If you just build it and leave it there, you're not going to get the best value from it. But if you start driving your suppliers, it'll be well worth your while.
So we've got a question. If a small business isn't using Xero or another service that supports e-invoicing, would they have to change their finance system, or are there other options?
Not necessarily. I mean, the common ones, of course, Xero, the different flavors of MYOB, QuickBooks, and I think now Recon as well, Perry.
Just last week, I think they went live.
I mean, all have enablement options available to them. Some of them are built into the existing subscription, so it's actually no cost to them either. And as I was suggesting, I don't have the exact percentage at my fingertips, but something ridiculous like 90+% of small businesses in New Zealand use one of those 4 platforms. So we're talking about the minority. But certainly there are still options, even if you're dealing with a sole trader who's doing their books in Excel. There are solutions in market that they can use to send an e-invoice to stay compliant and get faster payments. It might not be a Tickstar or a desktop imaging solution, because I'm not sure we scale down quite to that granular level of sending 1 or 2 e-invoices a month. But certainly there are providers in market that can do that. And if there are suppliers that are asking you guys those questions, we're more than happy to point them in the right direction.
I think the only one exception of a software product widely used in New Zealand that doesn't really support this natively yet for small business would be Henry on the sole traders. And they're monitoring this just as closely as many of the other software industries. So I think it's that same old question of it's just a matter of when.
I mean, but certainly with the bulk of council supply chains being made up of small to medium enterprise, and with the vast majority of that block using an e-invoicing capable platform already, I think it's a case of perhaps focusing on the maximum benefit that you can gain rather than focusing on the odd exception that needs to be managed as an obstacle to all the benefit that you're missing out on.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you, Chris. Thank you, Perry, for the webinar today. We're looking forward to seeing you at the Elgin conference, and please go to your stand, ask more questions as you think through this process. But and I hope Henry comes on board soon to fulfill the rest of the options available. So thank you again on behalf of the local government for joining us today, and we look forward to following the progress and seeing the stats rise for e-invoicing. So thank you very much.
Cool.
Thanks.
See you all.